There's no denying that North Sentinel Island is world famous.
North Sentinel Island.
North Sentinel Island.
North Sentinel Island.
North Sentinel Island.
The North Sentinel Island.
And why is this 60 square kilometer jungle-covered island in the middle of the Indian Ocean so famous? You know why. If you ask anyone if they've ever heard of that island with the uncontacted tribes still living in the Stone Age, they'll say yes. They might not know it by name, but they'll say yes. The people of North Sentinel Island remain totally resistant to the modern world and consistently refuse to allow those of us living in it to impose themselves onto their island. And what's better at firing imagination than something that's so completely off limits? But contrary to what most people would reasonably assume from the constant usage of the terms Stone Age and uncontacted in anything associated with the island online, the islanders are the furthest thing away from being uncontacted. And they use iron tools and have probably been doing so for millennia. There's a shockingly long history of outsiders encountering the Sentinelese and attempting to coerce the islanders into accepting their friendship. But despite not being able to communicate with us, the Sentinelese always make their position clear. It's their island and we shouldn't be on it. Their closest living relatives on the larger islands of the Andaman Archipelago, which North Sentinel is part of, have almost all acquiesced to outside influence, though to differing degrees. First, in the 19th century, the British made the islands a penal colony and attempted to coerce the islanders into submission by both impressing them with presence and with brute force. After the islands were given to India in the middle of the 20th century, the Indians have attempted to coerce the Andamanese into accepting coexistence with the island's massive population of Indian settlers with both presence and brute force, though they have at least tried to be a bit more compassionate and protective. Either way, all the groups that have opened themselves up to us are worse off for it. They've contracted horrible diseases, their land has been seized, their forests have been chopped down, their pigs have been poached, their populations have dwindled, and ultimately their original way of life, so ancient it has no age, is going extinct. But that's not so for the Sentinelese. They're willing to accept the odd gift now and again, or at least they were, but if you overstay your welcome and ignore their warnings to leave, they'll riddle you with arrows. But even despite that, I was completely blown away by how much information there really is about this island, and how fascinating and deep the history of our ill-fated attempts at winning them over really is. Even though it's just a tiny little island in the middle of the ocean, you wouldn't believe how deep the story of this place goes. The iceberg I made in my attempt at summing up everything we know about the place is so dense, and by the way, I'm probably missing a lot, that I'm afraid we won't be able to cover everything on it today. The video would just be way too long, and I've spent way too much time away to justify making it any longer than it is already. So today we'll be covering the top half of the iceberg, a summation of all the best known vignettes from the island's history, and all the baseline information there is to know about the Sentinelese and their closest relatives. So without further ado, let's begin. The Allen Chau incident, 2018. If you've heard anything about North Sentinel Island, it's probably something involving this incident. The needless death of 26-year-old American evangelical missionary Allen Chau when he attempted to preach the gospel to the Sentinelese back in 2018. It made headlines all over the world, and many others have already covered the story in way more depth than I ever could, and there's a lot else to cover, so I'm just going to go over the basic facts, focusing on what exactly he saw and wrote about in the days immediately preceding his untimely demise on the island. Chau was an avid outdoorsman from just south of the border from me in Vancouver, Washington. He was also an EMT, a soccer player, a globe-trotter, and most importantly to him, a dedicated Christian missionary. As such, it seems that he was fascinated by stories of adventure and survival beyond the limits of modern society. You know, like Robinson Crusoe and Hatchet, from a pretty young age. But he was especially fascinated with stories of missionaries contacting and converting remote tribes in Africa and the Amazon. And in a dark twist of irony, he was especially drawn to the story of Jim Elliot, one of 5 missionaries killed by Amazonian natives in the jungles of Ecuador back in 1956. after seeing that the people of North Sentinel Island were listed as being some of the last people on Earth who've never heard of Christianity on a website called the Joshua Project in high school, an idea began taking shape in Chau's mind. Maybe he could be the one to share the good news to them and save their souls. He later wrote, "The eternal lives of this tribe is at hand." At least that's what he seemed to think, since he also infamously referred to the island as the devil's last stronghold, which doesn't even make that much sense. I mean, there's still pagans a bit further east in the islands of Melanesia. This idea grew and grew until his goal in life was to live among the Sentinelese and convert them to his particular brand of evangelical Christianity. He even referred to this as his burden, and in one of his final notes, he thanks God for choosing him to be his messenger, even before I was yet formed in my mother's womb. So he definitely had a sense of destiny, if you can call it that. Contrary to popular misconception, he was not a Mormon. I know, it's a bit surprising, eh? Anyways, regardless, the guy was ready and willing to spend the rest of his life on the island. He even eschewed getting into relationships or having a full-time job because of it. Eventually, he even got in touch with a missionary organization named All Nations, based in Kansas City, Missouri, and went through missionary boot camp, which consisted of role-playing as missionaries making first contact with hostile tribesmen, played by the staff of All Nations. As if there were any world where that could possibly predict how the Sentinelese would react to Chau's presence. Chau even learned Xhosa, a language spoken in South Africa, to communicate with the Sentinelese, presumably based on his assumption that an African language would somehow be intelligible to them, because they're one of the last representatives of the first wave of humans to reach Asia from Africa in the Paleolithic. Although he did pick up a few words in more local languages. He even spent a whole summer studying linguistics here in British Columbia at the Canada Institute for Linguistics, so he could translate the Bible to them. But I mean, that's sort of a fool's errand. As we'll see, there have already been multiple instances of people trying to communicate with the Sentinelese using the language of their closest surviving relatives from some of the closest islands to them. And that hasn't worked, so I don't think Xhosa would cut it. And as he would eventually and unfortunately find out, the islanders didn't want an outsider imposing themselves onto their island. Chau traveled to Port Blair, the capital of the Andamans and its oldest city, in mid-October of 2018 with fellow missionaries. This was actually his fourth trip to the islands, the first being made in 2015. He spent the tense days leading up to his trip to North Sentinel lying low in a bungalow he referred to as a safe house in this handwritten journal he made, that's since been released by All Nations at Chau's own request. It's an incredible but very sad document, and from here on out, it's our main source on what Chau was up to. In the safe house, he prepared by praying, exercising, reading, and gathering together his kit, which included picture cards and gifts for the Sentinelese, as he was trying to persuade local fishermen to take him over to the islands and was waiting out a cyclone. During this time, he went without direct sunlight for 11 days, but he finally found 5 fellow Christian fishermen that he wound up paying 25,000 rupees to, or about $350, for the privilege of being ferried to North Sentinel. By the way, the reason why he was lying low and had to pay the fishermen so much is because the Indian authorities strictly forbid travel anywhere within 5 nautical miles of North Sentinel Island, which we'll find out more about later. And to make matters even worse, he couldn't communicate with his escort because they didn't speak any English, and I guess he didn't speak any Hindi. He finally arrived off the island shores around 10:30 p.m. on November the 14th, which he said was thanks to God himself hiding us from the Coast Guard and many patrols. In the early hours of the morning the next day, he and 2 of the fishermen made their first foray onto the island. Chau specifies that they waded out into the shallows around the northern curve of a cove on the southwestern shore of the island, probably near a place now since called Allen Point, and they did so to stash Chau's collapsible kayak and some gifts for the Sentinelese. Addendum. Actually, as a quick correction, I saw the term Allen Point being used on a map of the island published in a book from 1990. So, in an incredibly dark twist of irony, the place where John Allen Chau was about to lose his life shared the same name as him. He remarked that the dead coral that the ground is made up of was extremely sharp. This coral used to be well underwater, but was uplifted by the 2004 Indian earthquake and forms a ring around the island. The wreckage of a ship, probably the MV Rusley, which was wrecked off the coast in the 70s, is said to lie right near here, on coral that's since been uplifted. So, hey, at least it wasn't rusty metal. I think this ruddy stain on Google Earth is what remains of it. But anyways, later that morning, Chau spotted and even hastily drew one of the sorts of lean-to huts that other expeditions to the island have documented. These temporary lean-tos are used as shelters that the islanders and other related Andamanese groups used during their hunting expeditions, and the fact that fires have been found in them, a detail which also seems to show up in Chau's drawing, might also point to them being the dwellings of specific families. And that hut is where Chau decided to focus all of his efforts. He and the fishermen waved his hands and a cloth to attract attention to themselves, but it was of no use. The fishermen were no longer willing to go any closer to the island than half a mile, so Chau retrieved his kayak in nothing but black underwear, which he thought would make the islanders more comfortable with him since they always go naked, and with nothing much more than a barracuda and half of a tuna, which he plopped on top of the kayak as he rowed towards the hut. When he was about 400 yards out, he began hearing some women chattering in the distance and passed some of the Sentinel's characteristic dugout canoes, complete with outriggers. But it wasn't long before he met with some resistance. Two armed men, with two unstrung arrows each, came rushing out, yelling. In one of the last entries from his journal, he describes how he began to panic slightly as the Sentinelese strung their arrows. So he threw the tuna at them and hollered, "My name is John, I love you, and Jesus loves you." He doesn't clarify whether he was using English or Xhosa, but either way, the Sentinelese obviously had no idea what he was screaming at them, and they kept coming. So after sliding the barracuda off the prow of the kayak, he turned and paddled like I never have in my life, back to the fisherman's boat, though he also collapsed and stashed the kayak somewhere in the reef again. Chau was frightened, but was mostly just disappointed that the Sentinelese hadn't accepted him straight away. But still determined, he returned yet again later that same day, a few hours later, and made landfall around the same hut on the southwestern coast, where he brought out gifts like scissors, cord, and safety pins, fishing line, hooks, and rubber hosing that he placed on top of a log that he thought must have been placed where it was by one of the Sentinelese. In addition to two groupers the fisherman had just caught in the island's waters, he also brought along an emergency kit, especially for arrow wounds, that included things like abdominal pads and forceps if he needed to ever extricate any arrowheads out of his flesh, picture cards for communicating, multi-tools, and of course, multivitamins, his passport, and a waterproof Bible like this one. He headed towards what he thought was a dilapidated or maybe even destroyed shelter along the northern end of the cove, hoping to encounter the Sentinelese again. But that area seemed pretty devoid of life, so he headed towards where he'd first encountered the islanders a few hours earlier, next to that hut. Interestingly, he theorized that maybe the dilapidated hut had been built by poachers, based on the fact that he saw numerous rocky coral that jut out of the cove having lines wrapped around them. Half a dozen of the 10 bewildered islanders in the hut began to shout, and when Chau tried in vain to repeat the phrases the Sentinelese seemed to be yelling at him, they just burst out laughing. So as he suspected, they were probably trash-talking him. One of the only clips of the Sentinelese speaking is of one of them screwing with a documentary crew in pretty much the same way, and then doing this. Anyways, carrying on. They also began yelling back into the forest, and Chau recounts hearing some kind of drumming from within it. Then he saw some guy wearing what seemed to be a white crown made of what he thought might have been flowers, shouting at him from atop the highest coral boulder in the area. In the meantime, he sang some worship songs and spoke some Xhosa, which the Sentinelese seemed to tolerate for a moment in silence. At some point, he even used some phrases in Jarawa, spoken by some of the Sentinel's closest relatives on the island of South Andaman, which is actually pretty clever, and may have actually worked in the past, as we'll see, but nevertheless, they did not seem to understand them. Two men did drop their bows and began approaching his kayak and their canoe, which they propelled through the water with poles. They initially ignored the gifts he'd set aside for them on the log, but quickly turned back to grab them. He noted that if they see something they like, they'll take it by force if necessary. I wonder how many other folks have given them something. and if they feel like it's expected or due them. By the way, he was right in thinking that. But regardless of Chau's gifts, the Sentinelese seemed to be reaching the limit of what they could tolerate, and things soon went south. He heard some more yelling as a boy and a young woman appeared behind the men who'd just received the gifts, with their bows drawn. Chau says, "I kept waving my hands to say no bows, but they didn't get the message, I guess." He tossed his last gift, what he describes as a shovel or adze, midway between him and the islanders, but even though the adze is the Sentinelese tool of choice, it didn't make much of an impact. Soon the Sentinelese had almost encircled him. One unarmed man blocked his exit. Another came forward with a knife, so he figured this was it, and decided that this would be the ideal time to start preaching from Genesis, and stepped out of his kayak to show that I too have legs, as if that's why they wanted him gone. At this point, one of the men was just mere inches from him, and he noticed that he had yellowish pigment in circles on his cheeks, which interestingly does mirror the practices of the Sentinelese closest relatives, the Ongis, and matches 19th century descriptions of the Sentinelese themselves. But then, the next thing he knew, a boy he estimated to be about 10 years old had shot an arrow right into his Bible, which he was holding over his chest. Chau saw that the arrowhead was metal, thin but very sharp, which matches how arrows fired at Indian officials in the 80s were described as needle-like and made of iron. Chau wrote, "I stumbled back and I recall yelling at the kid for shooting me, but he decided to ignore the obvious and put an optimistic spin on things. Now as I look back at it, my Bible cover looks like bark, like tree bark, so maybe he was just curious, but yikes, it just gave me a fright." But he still couldn't escape feeling crushed. In one of his final messages, he wrote, "I've never felt this much grief or sorrow. Why?" in all caps. "Why did a little kid have to shoot me today? His high-pitched voice still lingers in my head." He even theorized that the Sentinelese hostility arose from ancestral memories of escaping from some slave ship, and without thinking, Chau tossed the arrowhead back to the kid, which he later regretfully wrote about. But as they've done in the past with others, the Sentinelese let him off with a warning yet again, and left him alone as they let him swim the mile or so to the fisherman's boat, since they did decide to impound his kayak. As he was watching the sunset, he wrote, "Wondering if it'll be the last sunset I see before being in the place where the sun never sets. Why does this beautiful place have to have so much death? I hope this isn't one of my last notes, but if it is, to God be the glory." He was last seen alive by the fisherman the next day. He decided to be dropped off alone near one of the caches he'd made, and from there he'd walk down the beach to the same hut he'd just come from. He deliberately decided to meet the Sentinelese without the fisherman's boat nearby, and wrote that he only intended for them to return the following night, because he thought that maybe the presence of the boat was spooking the Sentinelese. He even mentioned how he knew of a fellow missionary who'd successfully met with one of the Sentinelese relatives, the Jarawa, with no boat nearby. But he had another reason for this. If he was killed, then at least the fisherman wouldn't have to bear witness to it. Apparently those 2 points made him feel at peace with the whole plan. The following morning, Chau would launch his third and final attempt at approaching the islanders after writing a final 3-page journal entry in pencil, mostly consisting of farewell messages to his family and friends. Writing, "You guys might think I'm crazy in all this, but I think it's worth it to declare Jesus' name. Please do not be angry with them or at God, and that the eternal lives of this tribe is at hand, and I can't wait to see them around the throne." A day or so later, after returning from their normal fishing routine, the fishermen complicit in illegally ferrying Chau to the island watched as his lifeless body was dragged along the beach with a rope and buried. According to an email sent by a fellow missionary to Chau's mother, he was never to be seen again. The Indian authorities have since prosecuted 7 people involved in this, but the question over what, if anything, should be done for Chau's remains still lingers. A helicopter was sent to assess the situation on the 20th of November, and on the 24th, a boat filled with local policemen came to the site of Chau's death, hoping to procure the body. They wisely maintained a distance of some 400 meters away from the beach, where they stared down the Sentinelese in a tense standoff. Nothing more was done, and frankly, it should probably stay that way. A murder case was opened, but that's understandably been heavily criticized, and it's not like any of the Sentinelese are ever going to be arrested for this. And Chau himself wrote, "Don't retrieve my body." Different people have reacted to Chau's failed mission in wildly different ways. Some of his fellow missionaries praise him as a martyr, and most others call him an idiot. But I personally don't think he's either. I do truly admire that he was so committed to his dream and to serving something bigger than himself, that he was willing to and did perish for it. But at the same time, his very presence on the island put the people he was trying to help in mortal danger. Admittedly, he was vaccinated for 13 different illnesses and quarantined himself before going to the island, but who knows what pathogens he could have and maybe did unwittingly transfer to them. As we'll see, their relatives on the larger and more populous Andamans were completely decimated by horrible diseases unwittingly brought by the British, and some may have even already gotten to the island. So these people have no immunity to diseases we don't even think about anymore. But the main flaw with Chau's idea was just the fact that he didn't do his research. I mean, he did research. He compiled a giant dossier on his plans to ingratiate himself with the Sentinelese, complete with a map of safe landing sites. But he just chose to ignore so many aspects of the island's historical context. First, the islanders have never allowed outsiders to stay on their island without either A, melting into the island's dense jungle interior to wait for the right moment to strike, or B, immediately confronting the trespasser with a hail of arrows. Though for a brief period in the early 90s, that wasn't the case, and there was some friendly contact between outside parties and the Sentinelese, but we'll get to that at the end of the video. And the one time a British colonial official named Maurice Vidal Portman was able to force his way into the interior without an immediate response in 1880, he forcibly abducted an elderly couple and some children. You know what happened to those Sentinelese that Portman kidnapped? The two elderly people sickened rapidly and died, and it's possible that Portman abused the children in the worst way possible. When Indian authorities again penetrated into the island's interior in 1967, some of its less scrupulous members raided the abandoned village they came across for souvenirs, and there's even evidence that the Sentinelese were the last recipients of a syphilis epidemic that ravaged across the islands in the 1880s. But we don't know who spread it or how. Was it the British? Was it contact with other Andamanese people infected by the British? Or maybe it was the Malay pirates that were accustomed to raiding the Andamans for slaves. And it's very possible that, just as Chau observed himself, the Sentinelese may still have to deal with the occasional unsavory poacher or smuggler from elsewhere in Southeast Asia. So though the untimely death of Chau is undoubtedly a tragedy, my point is us outsiders have always left a bitter taste in the Sentinelese mouths, and we always seem to go too far. So why should they expect anything different now? The Drunk Fisherman Incident of 2006. If you've heard anything else about North Sentinel Island besides the unfortunate fate of John Allen Chau, you've probably also heard of the similar fates which befell two Indian fishermen who found themselves illegally fishing in the restricted waters surrounding the island, which unfortunately meant that they didn't see the end of January 2006. Back in 1956, the Indian government passed the Andaman and Nicobar Islands Protection of Aboriginal Tribes Act, which banned private visits to the island and forbid any boats from getting closer than 5 nautical miles from it, mostly to spare the Sentinelese from the contagious diseases we outsiders would inevitably transfer to them. Though that of course didn't stop official visits to them, but anyways, this exclusion zone is regularly patrolled by the Indian Navy and Coast Guard, at least ostensibly. Later on, we'll see that it's a bit more porous than it should be, and the same kind of small fishing boat these two fishermen were piloting had become a common sight off the island in the late 90s, with residents of nearby Port Blair looking to privately take part in dismantling the cargo ships rotting on the reefs there. But what happened to these two fishermen seems like a pretty clear sign that to the Sentinelese, they were far from welcome. Sundar Raj and Pandit Tiwari were two ex-cons that somehow became friends in prison, despite going there for very different reasons. Raj had murdered his ex-wife, and Tiwari had been jailed for petty theft. After being released, they bought a fishing dinghy, using money reportedly dubiously siphoned off from the aid money sent to the islands after it was devastated by the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. A couple of years later, in January of 2006, the two men joined a convoy of ships fishing in the exclusion zone off North Sentinel, after setting off from nearby Wandoor. At some point, they reportedly got drunk on palm wine and fell asleep, and while they were unconscious, their boat began drifting towards the island. According to the other fishermen there that night, the two men were immediately encircled by a body of Sentinelese men armed with axes and were immediately killed, though possibly after escaping the boat and making a run for it. It's possible that the reason for this was that they aroused the Sentinelese anger by showing up unannounced and by not offering them any gifts, since every other friendly expedition to the island did so. And there's a good chance that the Sentinelese have encountered other illegal poachers that we don't know about, and we have no idea how that would have turned out. But ultimately, we'll never know their exact motives, other than that these were intruders, they didn't belong on their island. There was at least one attempted official gift-dropping expedition made in 2005, but it had also been a very long time since the last really friendly encounters between the Sentinelese and outsiders in the early 90s. One journalist also raised the possibility that, since there isn't actually any hard testimony from the other poachers there on account of them, being there illegally and being unwilling to share concrete testimony, and no autopsies being done on the bodies, that maybe the two men had drunk themselves to death before reaching shore. What exactly happened to the bodies is a bit muddled because different secondary sources disagree about what exactly went down. The Sentinelese, for their part, definitely weren't happy with the helicopter that came round to inspect the bodies. According to one source, the pilot reported that they were just 200 meters away and were attacking my helicopter with everything they had. Arrows were flying everywhere. So the helicopter had to temporarily vacate the area. Once it came back, though, the bodies were nowhere to be seen. But the Sentinelese were still hanging around and obviously still pretty annoyed, so the helicopter crew drew the Sentinelese away from the rough positions of the bodies by flying to the other end of the island. When they followed it there, the helicopter made a beeline back where it had first spotted the bodies and somehow rediscovered them when its rotors kicked up the sand the Sentinelese had buried them in. According to one source, one of the fishermen's bodies was actually recovered while the other had to be abandoned. But a more recent academic source reveals that the most the authorities were able to do was show the photos of the bodies, which it of course never revealed publicly, to one of the deceased's wives, and alluded to other family members being allowed to peek at the bodies from a distance with binoculars. The consternation of the local Indian settler community over the government's failure to retrieve the bodies was real, and some, like Sundar Raj's wife, called for revenge against the islanders. She threatened to take her case to court and decried the Sentinelese as murderers. Bit ironic since she married one herself, but oh well. Conversations with the broader community also revealed that they generally felt that the Sentinelese ought to have been settled and made to work hard like them so that their land could be put to better use, whatever that means. So thank God the situation didn't boil over into a hostile takeover, because it seems like it really could have at some point. But Tiwari's family had the opposite response, though. His father said, "As far as I am concerned, the Sentinelese are the victims in this, not my son. They live in constant terror of heavily armed poachers from Myanmar, Burma, and Port Blair. They were only defending themselves with bows and arrows and rocks in the only way they know how. What I do want is my son's body so my wife and I can cremate him. It is an impossible case to prosecute anyway." There was also some talk of mounting an expedition to retrieve the bodies after tensions had cooled down for a bit, but that never went anywhere. And it was only until I was writing this script that I discovered that a repeat of this exact thing happened at the tail end of 2023. This time, 3 fishermen, again from Wandoor, suddenly disappeared, with the only clue to their whereabouts being that their dinghy was spotted grounded on the shoals ringing North Sentinel Island. This time there weren't any bodies, but I'm pretty sure we can all guess what must have happened. Though at the time, the families reasoned that they were still alive, and talk of a rescue operation was reported. For whatever reason, this story doesn't seem to have gone international like the one from 2006, but it's still a very interesting case. The wreck of the MV Primrose, 1981. Shortly before midnight on August 2nd, 1981, a Panamanian-registered freighter traveling between Bangladesh and Australia, its cargo mostly consisting of poultry feed and fertilizer, suddenly ran aground on a coral reef just off the northwestern coast of North Sentinel Island. The wreck's husk, though largely broken up throughout the 90s, is still visible on Google Earth and is definitely up there as one of the weirdest things visible from satellite. So you've probably heard about it before. The sea was too rough for its crew of 28 to lower their lifeboats, so the captain opted to keep his crew on board, which turned out to be a very fortuitous decision given what was just about to happen. After 3 days of just sitting there, they finally caught a glimpse of their Sentinel hosts, and they did not look very welcoming. At first they confused them with a rescue party, but that quickly changed when they brought out some binoculars and saw who they really were. Based on their hostile gestures and the fact that they were carrying bows and spears, the crew of the Primrose quickly realized the danger they were in and plunged into panic, and the captain immediately sent the following SOS message to their bosses at the Regent Shipping Company headquartered in Hong Kong.
Wild men, estimate more than 50, carrying various homemade weapons or making 2 or 3 wooden boats, worrying they will board us at sunset. All crew members' lives are not guaranteed.
Hilariously, a spokesman from the government of Hong Kong said the captain seemed like he'd gone bananas. He also requested an immediate airdrop of guns, which luckily doesn't seem to have ended up happening. The Primrose's crew kept up a 24-hour guard with whatever perceivable weapons they could find lying about, including a flare gun, some axes, and some bits of pipe. And even before the situation was resolved, it became a bit of a media sensation. And another spokesman from the Indian government even had to deny that the islanders were cannibals. We'll see where that myth comes from in a bit, but I can tell you that it involves Marco Polo. After almost a week had passed of this tense standoff, the stranded sailors were airlifted off the Primrose in a helicopter that had to make 3 different relays with a rope ladder dangled down to them. Luckily, the dramatic scene was captured in photographs taken by the pilot, an American named Robert Four, whose pictures eventually wound up in this Der Spiegel article. Apparently, the wreck was initially like 400 feet off the coast, right across from a little spit, but given how much the island was uplifted in 2004, which we'll get to, it's basically right on it now. And if you play around with the dates of the satellite imagery of it, you can see that either sea levels around the island are rising, or the boat itself is sinking, since from 2011 on, you can see its hull getting more and more submerged. And what's even more interesting is that the Primrose has a definite history post this incident, and there are actually eyewitness reports of the Sentinelese climbing up onto the boat with official shipbreakers on it and getting iron from them. Which leads us to our next topic, the 20th century Iron Age myth. And this leads me into one of the most widespread myths about the Sentinelese, that they didn't have iron until shipwrecks like the Primrose started running aground on the island's reefs, which just isn't true, but I don't blame you for not knowing that. The references to the Sentinelese and other Andamanese groups possessing iron tools is mostly buried in really old obscure books and websites, and before looking into them for this video, I thought that too. I even remember bringing it up as a fun fact about them pretty recently, but as I've also learned, the Sentinelese destroy every expectation you'd have of them at every corner you turn. Despite their extreme isolation, the Sentinelese make enormous iron arrowheads, knives, and adze heads which dwarf those of their cousins on the larger Andamans. And for context, an adze is like a sideways axe. Its stone precursor was super popular back in prehistory, and curiously, stone examples were popular until relatively recently in the South Pacific. Here's some footage of the Sentinelese using their iron examples to rake in coconuts thrown at them. I love how nonchalantly they swing them over their shoulders. It just looks so natural for some reason. Maybe I have blood memory from the Neolithic, who knows. My weird prehistory-based fantasies aside, reports of iron being in demand in the Andamans go back way further than you'd think. When the Chinese monk Yi Tsing was passing by the islands, which he referred to as the land of the naked people, on his way to India in the early 670s 70s AD, he reported that when the natives saw our vessel coming, they eagerly embarked in little boats, their number being fully 100. They all brought coconuts, bananas, and things made of rattan cane and bamboos, and wished to exchange them. What they are anxious to get is iron only. For a piece of iron as large as 2 fingers, one gets from them 5 to 10 cocoa nuts. The natives live solely on cocoa nuts and tubers. There is not much rice, and therefore what they hold most precious and valuable is loha, which is the name for iron in this country. There is a possibility that he's referring to the Shompen people of the Nicobars just south of the Andamans here, because he explicitly says that the population was not black, and the Andamanese definitely are, but there's solid physical evidence of iron being in the Andamans in the form of an unidentifiable piece of iron of unknown origins found within the bottommost layer of a site just west of Port Blair called Chaldari Midden, which dates to 2,300 years ago. Also very much in line with Eatsing's account, Arab travelers in the 9th century recorded that when a ship passes near, the men come out in boats of various sizes and barter ambergris and coconuts for iron. Much more recently, but still quite a while back ago, in 1867, the captain of another boat which ran aground on North Sentinel's reefs, the Nineveh, reported that the weapons that he and his crew were at the pointy ends of were tipped with what else but iron. Then later on, a certain colonial administrator named Maurice Vidal Portman, who we'll definitely be rounding back to, noted that the presents which the Ongis most appreciate are hoop iron, rod iron, files, sleeping mats, coconuts, plantains, etc. etc. Now, these Ongis are pretty universally recognized as being the Sentinel's closest living relatives. When an official Indian gift-dropping mission pushed its luck in 1974, the Sentinelese fired an arrow at a film director. The footage I'm using is from what he was making, Man in Search of Man, and it hit his thigh. Luckily, it was only a flesh wound, but the anthropologist accompanying them, Triloknath Pandit, noted that it was a bit of iron fashioned like a nail. He noted seeing a similar arrowhead that was fired into the water and then retrieved by its shooter in 1987. That same year, he even spotted an iron arrowhead that he described as a trident. You see, the Sentinelese have very unique multiple-headed arrows, and there's even one with 4 heads in a major European museum, which we'll get back to later, of course. TK Pandit, who we're going to be hearing tons more about, by the way, also became one of the only people ever to walk inside a Sentinelese village back in 1967 on his first expedition to the island. The village was deserted, but he observed a number of interesting artifacts, including 2 stones identified as grinding and hammer stones, respectively. One bore traces of having iron tools sharpened on it, and the other was more rounded and even seemed to have a built-in grip. The Sentinelese probably used these sorts of objects to cold forge their iron into the tools they make. The eyewitness accounts of the Sentinelese taking part in the scrapping of MV Primrose in the 90s adds yet another dimension to all of this and shows that they even have preferences for certain types of iron scraps, probably because of how limited their arsenal of ironworking tools is. The following quote comes from one of the 5 Mohammed brothers, a family of shipbreakers based in Port Blair who were officially auctioned the rights to salvaging the wreck in 1991 and routinely went back and forth to the island for the better part of the 90s. According to a fascinating interview with one of them in 1993 by another Indian anthropologist, Vishwajit Pandya, when I went with my workers to start recovering and cutting out all that could be recovered from the stuck cargo ship, we were all worried. We were told that Sentinelese were far away, but we still carried firecrackers, short of guns, to scare the tribals, just in case. On reaching the location, it was evident that somebody had been on the decks of the partially submerged ship, as we found burnt firewood and used candlesticks and paper wrappers and bottles. These were obviously left by fishermen who came aboard to gather what they could. After 2 days, in the early morning when it was low tide, we saw 3 Sentinelese canoes with about a dozen men about 50 feet away from the deck of Primrose. We were skeptical and scared and had no other solution but to bring out our supply of bananas and show it to them to attract them and minimize any chance of hostility. They took the bananas and came up on board and were frantically looking around for smaller pieces of metal scrap, much of what our workers had cut up with torchlights. The welding torch was a major scare for them, something we discovered every time they visited us. We, however, would oblige them with small pieces of iron rod, but they preferred flat strips, which we did provide them. They visited us regularly, at least twice or thrice in a month, while we worked at the site for about 18 months, excluding the heavy rain season. So they had regular close encounters with the Sentinelese, but hardly anyone knows about it because nothing happened. The Sentinelese weren't hostile when their guests had something valuable to offer them while they were on their turf. Just think about it. The Mohammeds were literally in the exact same place as the original crew of the Primrose, but everyone was chill. The Sentinelese also used purely wooden arrows, and probably sometimes used stone or possibly even beach glass as cutting tools, like their close but more welcoming relatives, the Ongis of Little Andaman Island. So maybe the way they use their tech will give us an insight into how the Sentinelese use theirs. What I find really interesting about it is that in addition to beach glass, they're known to use the edges of shells to shape wood, and because of that, they notice that metal gets more luster when it's rubbed, just like the shiny abalone inside shells. Vishwajit Pandya even recounts that he was irritated by how the Ongi men he was with were constantly rubbing their iron blades with a type of wedge-shaped whetstone they call tajage, that they carry everywhere. And I love this quote from him. The noise of the metal scraping against stone is referred to as yushie, a piece of onomatopoeia that is also used to describe the call of the dugong. For some reason, there's also occasional reference to gold being on the islands. Niccolo Conti in the 15th century said the name Andaman, obviously the precursor of Andaman, meant island of gold, though he didn't have very many things to say about it other than anyone who landed there would immediately be torn to pieces. Eat Singh explained to his readers that this island does not produce iron at all. Gold and silver also are rare, so does that mean they had it or not? But regardless, a more important question is, how have they managed to get their hands on a steady enough supply of iron to justify making these large iron tools for possibly millennia? The ships that occasionally found themselves wrecked off the island probably weren't enough to supply the Sentinelese with the iron they needed, which raises the possibility that they may have had even more extensive relationships with outsiders than we'd think in order to obtain it. Although most medieval mentions of the Andamans are pretty explicit about how dangerous it is to find yourself on them, maybe repetitions of the sort of canoe-to-ship, spur-of-the-moment trade deals Eat Singh and the Arab travelers describe were happening on a more regular basis than we'd think. But there is a third possibility. George Webber, on his excellent archived site all about the Andamanese, outlines a really unique legend the Andamanese have about how they first encountered iron. The first man, named either Tomo or Dooku, went on a fishing expedition one day and shot an arrow. He missed his target and instead struck a hard substance that proved to be a piece of iron. The legend states that this was the first iron found by the natives. From the new substance, Dooku made himself an arrowhead, with which he also scarified or tattooed himself. He then sang a ditty to the effect that now that he was scarified, nothing could strike him. Weber raises the possibility that this might be recounting the chance discovery of meteoric iron, since there are no known iron deposits on the Andamans, though I think it might just be referring to some piece of iron junk that washed up on a beach somewhere. Maybe that's another way the Sentinelese have been getting their iron. Though then again, last time I checked, metal doesn't flow too well. Tsunami Uplifting Event 2004. On Boxing Day of 2004, a devastating tsunami ripped through the Indian Ocean and hit the Andamans hard. Thousands of Indians on the main islands lost their lives, and the rescue efforts were painfully slow. Eventually, the Indian government decided to dispatch a helicopter to check in on the Sentinelese, expecting the worst. But when it flew over the island, it found its occupants alive and healthy enough to face the helicopter down with their bows. Boats also reportedly came by to see how they were doing, but met with the same response. And the pictures from this of blurry, uncontacted tribespeople facing down a helicopter with such ancient tech fired people's imaginations the world over. And prior to the untimely death of John Allen Chau, the taking of these photographs was probably the most well-known vignette in the island's history. And it's still a pretty well-known story, but there's a bigger picture, as per usual. The aerial survey wound up citing 32 living Sentinelese and no casualties, but the earthquake that created that tsunami completely changed the makeup of their island, and their way of life must have changed with it. Parts of the island were uplifted 1 to 2 meters, while other parts sunk, though generally the shallow coral reefs around the island dried up, and even some small outlying islands, like Constance Island, just off its southeastern corner, were joined to the mainland. So North Sentinel actually grew quite a bit, but an expedition sent out to them in 2005 found out that wasn't exactly ideal for the Sentinelese. Vishwajit Pandya, who was part of it, later wrote, "I realized that the aerial photographs or the satellite images could not convey the scale of the change that had taken place. That's because that extra land of theirs was just a 70 to 150 foot wide barrier of stinking sun-dried coral, which created what seemed to be an impassable barrier between North Sentinel's former beach and the new coastline. I mean, would you want to walk over the equivalent of 70 feet of Legos just to get your toes wet? No, though obviously that doesn't apply everywhere on the island, and there are still bits where the water is still pretty close to the tree line. But this has definitely thrown a wrench in the sort of gift drops the Indian authorities had been conducting with the Sentinelese since 1967. Pandya says, "Now it is not possible for the Sentinelese to just stand on the sandy beach and have a visual contact with the contact party. Neither is it possible for the Sentinelese to drag their canoes onto the sandy shoreline and launch it into the sea. In fact, during my 2005 visit, after a long search, we did spot a group of 6 Sentinelese standing and staring at us, waiting for the gunny bags full of coconuts to be cast towards them. It was practically impossible for them to come towards the waterline. The bags of coconuts were dropped, but the Sentinelese didn't manage to collect it, nor could we deposit it for them. But they've clearly been able to adapt somehow. I mean, they're still out there, and they certainly don't seem to want any help from us, so good for them." And it's a bit ironic that the Sentinelese, as well as their better understood cousins on the bigger Andaman Islands, the Ongis and the Jarawa, managed to withstand the tsunami better than its modern settlers, despite how advanced they are in comparison. Maybe the Sentinelese had a better understanding of early warning signs modern people just aren't as attuned to, like the movements of birds and the behavior of animals, or just the fact that the earth shook and the waters receded for a moment. Both the Ongis and the Jarawa reportedly had the intuitive understanding that they needed to get to higher ground deeper in their forests because of their folklore telling them to do just that when the right signals came. The zoo hypothesis. This refers to the pretty popular idea that the Sentinelese are a real-life example of the zoo hypothesis, the philosophical notion that Earth is just a big zoo for super-advanced aliens who could otherwise easily wipe us out, but instead opt to just watch our silly antics for their own amusement instead. And then I guess that entails maybe occasionally visiting us up close to see how we react. That seems to describe a nature reserve better than a zoo, but you get what I mean. It's pretty similar to how we treat the Sentinelese, and so the Sentinelese are often cited as evidence that it's at least possible. And just think of what it must be like from their perspective. Yeah, I'm sure they understand by now that we're just people like them, though early on some other Andamanese did think of outsiders as ancestral ghosts. They do, however, constantly come into contact with technology they can't possibly fathom, wielded with ease by people whose origins and motives and intentions are totally inconceivable. Like, what the was going through their heads when they saw that guy's blowtorch? And what do they even think motorboats and cargo ships are? Do they understand that they're just bigger versions of the outrigger canoes they use and the washed-up fishing dinghies they're familiar with, or some kind of horrific mechanical monster, as some have suggested, that just so happen to die on their beaches once in a while? No wonder they're afraid of us getting too close, and they don't know that the squiggles they see on the boats people bring by are letters and numbers. They have no idea how our weapons work, they don't know why we leave gifts for them, and they certainly don't understand that pieces of colored paper with more squiggles on them mean they belong to India. It's a cool concept, and hey, maybe it's true. I mean, it would definitely explain all the UFO footage that's been coming out, I guess. You might expect this entry to be lowered down because of how existentially freaky it is, but I think in general it's one of the best known things associated with the island. The YouTuber incident of 2025. Oh my gosh, what are we doing to these poor islanders? This is the most recent news story from the island, so tons of other people have already covered it, and it's still sort of a developing story, so I'll be brief. In March of 2025, a 24-year-old small-time American travel vlogger named Mikhailo Polyakov was arrested by the Indian authorities after landing on North Sentinel Island. He didn't want to proselytize to the Sentinelese or try to establish friendly relationships with them. No, he just did it for the views. It was just a publicity stunt. And before this, he even LARPed as Lord Miles and went into Taliban-controlled Afghanistan for the same reason, uploading a moderately successful 5-part series on it to his channel. The channel's name pretty much tells you everything you need to know about him, it seems. He got to the island in an inflatable boat with a Suzuki motor he assembled at a local workshop attached to it that he launched from a place called Kerma Dere Beach on the western coast of South Andaman around 1 in the morning. During his 5-minute-long early morning foray onto one of the island's beaches, he didn't even meet any Sentinelese. He just left a half-drunk can of Diet Coke and a coconut on the ground and collected some useless sand samples. The footage on his GoPro was impounded by the Indian police anyways, so in the end he doesn't even have a video to show for it, although that might change. But other than that, I really, really hope none of the Sentinelese drank from that can. Imagine how many diseases it could transfer to them. For all we know, the islanders might be suffering from a horrible epidemic right now because of Polyakov. We don't know. And this wasn't even the guy's first attempt at reaching the island. In October of 2024, he tried using an inflatable kayak to get over there, presumably also from South Andaman, but staff at the hotel he was staying at were able to stop him that time. Then he visited the islands again in January of 2025 when he illegally recorded some of the Jarawa, some of the Sentinelese closest relatives, on Baratang Island. But after this latest incident, he was taken to a local court and remained in police custody for at least 3 days. And there was some uncertainty over where he was and what would happen to his YouTube channel, but apparently he's out because just 3 days ago, as of writing this, he released a teaser for an upcoming video about his stupid stunt on the island, which consists of footage of the island he took on a plane above it, and interestingly, some of the footage he took while on the boat heading to or from the island itself. So maybe he was somehow able to negotiate the footage back, or maybe this is from his first attempt on that kayak. I'm not sure. How many are there? The answer to this question, as with most other questions us in the outside world have about North Sentinel, is that there isn't an answer. We just don't know. But there are some rough guesses. And by rough, I mean rough, because the estimates of how many living Sentinelese there are range from a measly 15 to a whopping 400, and even 500. Because again, they're all just educated guesses. A 2011 census says that the population stands at a measly 15. TK Pandit, who I think has to qualify as the world's leading expert on the Sentinelese because he literally wrote the book on them based on his interactions with them over decades, from 1967 to 1991, guesses that there were some 80 to 100 of them at the time. That might not sound like a lot, but even Pandit himself says that that's an optimistic estimate and clarified that besides, the area of the island is about 60 square kilometers, which would normally support a population of only about 40 in terms of hunting-gathering economy standards, whereby one man roughly needs about 1.5 square kilometers of forest land to survive. But that ignores the fact that they have rich sea resources all around the island. Pandit also estimates that a single sea turtle weighing 15 to 50 kilograms could support a whole band of 20 to 30 people for a couple of days. And in any case, groups of up to 30 to 60 people have actually been observed on the beach in single encounters. But a lot of the time, the expeditions Pandit was attached to didn't encounter anyone, or much smaller groups of 2 to 12, suggesting to him that they must keep moving around in search of food and lead a semi-nomadic existence. More recently, another leading expert on the Sentinelese, Vishvajit Pandya, has a less optimistic take, based on his own observations from being to the island 3 3 times between 1993 to 2005, and just the general consensus among administrators in Port Blair, he thinks the population stands at about 40. And the historical estimates he's collected, though incredibly variable, and this 500 in particular is incredibly unrealistic, shows a little bit of gradual decline, which just seems so odd. Imagine if just 40 people are at the heart of all this intrigue and fascination and controversy and debate surrounding North Sentinel. The Close Encounters, 1991. The Sentinelese had been regularly visited by Indian gift-dropping missions, which mostly just gave them endless bags of coconuts throughout the 70s and 80s. The islanders were mostly happy with their gifts, but understandably didn't let their uninvited guests get anywhere near them, and when they overstayed their welcome, the Sentinelese would respond with open hostility. But they finally chose to break out of their shells a bit and allowed the outsiders to get the closest they've ever and probably will ever get to them in 1991, when they willingly approached at least 2 different Indian contact parties to make hand-to-hand contact with them. The many encounters between the Indian authorities and the Sentinelese that took place prior to this, which were spearheaded by that anthropologist guy, Triloknath Pandit, are equally interesting, especially since they provide us some of our only peeks at what lies inside the island's mysterious interior. But I decided to leave those juicy details for later, because the events of 1991 probably comprise the best-known amicable encounters between the Sentinelese and the modern world. On January 4th, 1991, a gift-dropping mission was sent to North Sentinel Island yet again. Pandit wasn't involved this time, but his colleagues Madhumala Chattopadhyay and Mr. S.A. Arawati were, along with a whole gaggle of bureaucrats who competed to take part in the expedition. They approached one of the island's beaches in a motorized dinghy launched from a ship named the MV Tarmugli, which must have been a familiar sight to the Sentinelese because that same ship had been routinely reused to ferry contact parties to and from the island for decades at this point, since at least 1970. At first, none of the Sentinelese were coming out, but then a few of them stepped out of the jungle and began making gestures the anthropologists seemed to have correctly identified as pleas for gifts. They also appeared unarmed, which was somewhat unusual, though not completely unprecedented. Instead, they only carried some mesh baskets and some of their giant adzes, presumably to crack the coconuts open. As the Indian contact party threw their coconuts into the surf, 5 of the Sentinelese waded into the water, and some others got into one of their canoes to retrieve them. The contact party gestured for the Sentinelese to come closer, but that's when their usual caution kicked in, so the crew of the Tarmugli went to lunch. They returned that afternoon and witnessed something remarkable. One Sentinelese guy started getting a bit fidgety with his bow and arrows, but then some older woman began reprimanding him for it. And the visit commenced peacefully after he ritually buried them in the sand. So the Sentinelese sort of literally buried the hatchet, at least for the time being. This gesture signaled a great many more Sentinelese to materialize out of the forest and wade to the dinghy, and then they just began exchanging coconuts hand to hand. Ironically, one of the people photographed doing this, S.A. Awaradi, a local director of tribal welfare, had written a poignant argument for leaving the islanders completely alone almost exactly a year before. And he wrote, "What right does the modern man have got to interfere in the totally isolated tribal life of the Sentinelese? What right does he have to decide unilaterally to impose his friendship on the Sentinelese who has been vehemently resisting it? Is it not their fundamental community right to live their own way, which they have been enjoying time immemorial?" Pandit attempted to replicate this kind of close encounter just a few weeks later at the same location, perhaps with the hopes of cementing their newfound friendly relationship. His party were greeted by another big group of Sentinelese, and they arguably got even closer than before. In addition to wading up to the expedition's dinghy, 2 Sentinelese men even clambered aboard it, which tends to happen during gift drops to their cousins, the Jarawa. Pandit later told the BBC, "We were puzzled why they allowed us. It was their decision to meet us, and the meeting took place on their terms." Pandit even jumped into the water himself, going neck deep as he distributed coconuts directly by hand to the Sentinelese, when previously he'd mostly just hurriedly dropped off bags of coconuts on the beach, run off, and then wait to see when the ever-cautious Sentinelese would come out and get them. According to Pandit, there was no threat and no hostility. and he recounts that for a few minutes he was alone in the water, completely surrounded by the Sentinelese. But after Pandit became separated from the main body of Indians, the Sentinelese made it all too clear that they had had enough. When a young Sentinelese man, or boy, made a funny face, drew his knife out, and mimed cutting Pandit's head off. So, seeing where things were going, Pandit made the smart choice to immediately get the dinghy to pick him back up. He was familiar with how the islanders tell people to screw off, later telling Indian Express, "If we tried to venture into their territory without respecting their wishes or got too close for comfort, they would turn their back on us and sit down on their haunches, as if to defecate. That was meant to be an insult. If we didn't pay heed and stop, they would shoot arrows as a last resort." During past expeditions to the island, he had also witnessed the Sentinelese firing off warning shots from their bows that seemed to have been deliberately shot off mark, even while their targets were well in range. So the Sentinelese don't just arbitrarily riddle trespassers with arrows. They have the courtesy to give them some due warning. But besides the knife incident that ended this encounter, it's remembered as being mostly friendly, and mostly characterized by smiles and excitement. Despite how exciting it was, though, Pandit couldn't help feeling a palpable sense of loss. He later told fellow author Adam Goodhart in the latter's New Delhi hotel room, "They must have come to a decision that the time had come, that they voluntarily came forward to meet us. It was unbelievable. It couldn't have happened on the spur of the moment." But there was this feeling of sadness also. I did feel it. And there was the feeling that at a larger scale of human history, these people who were holding back, holding on, ultimately had to yield. It's like an era in history gone. The islands have gone. Until the other day, the Sentinelese were holding the flag, unknown to themselves. They were being heroes, but they have also given up. Maybe he's reading a bit too much into it there, but I think it's pretty poignant. And because of the magnitude of this occasion, or at least its perceived magnitude, it's even been reported that after the whole thing was said and done, the debate over who first touched the Sentinelese became an emotionally charged issue within various sectors of the Andamanese administration, where claims and counterclaims were sought to be established with earnestness and vigor. The later 90s would also witness the Sentinelese closest relatives, the Jarawa, come out of their jungle hideouts en masse to initiate peaceful contact with Indian settlers, who they had hitherto had a rather strained and even violent relationship with. But for whatever reason, it was almost simultaneously decided that official gift drops to the Sentinelese would be put to an end. Though what exactly was going on between the Indian authorities and the shipbreakers dismantling Primrose and the Sentinelese themselves in the later 90s is really murky, and different sources contradict each other about its exact end date. Either way, the Sentinelese haven't opted to open up any further than they did in 1991, and I'm sure their unfortunate run-ins with fishermen and missionaries and maybe the odd poacher and of course YouTubers hasn't helped much. Addendum. A Nat Geo article published in the aftermath of Chau's demise based on Chattopadhyay's testimony reveals more details I missed at first glance. Chattopadhyay returned to the island a second time with Pandit in February of 1991, with an even larger group than before, and apparently the administration wanted to make the Sentinelese familiar with all of them, maybe pointing to the hope that the islanders would open up to sustained contact, though I'm not sure about that. Chattopadhyay repeats the detail that one or maybe multiple Sentinelese climbed into the team's boat, apparently to take an entire bag of coconuts, and they even tried to take the rifle belonging to the police, mistaking it to be a piece of metal. Or maybe not. Who knows? And she repeats the fact that the expedition ended with a knife being drawn, in a manner similar to what Pandit remembers, but she added that it was only because one of the team members tried to take an ornament made out of leaves worn by a Sentinelese man. A few months later, she embarked on yet another expedition to North Sentinel, but poor weather conditions spoiled it, and they didn't land. They didn't even see any of the Sentinelese. But I think the most intriguing detail she adds is that according to her, the reason why the first expedition wasn't cut short by arrow fire was because she spoke to the Sentinelese using some Andamanese words she'd picked up while doing fieldwork among the other tribes, which incited the Sentinelese woman to chastise her male counterpart for aiming at the expedition. But frustratingly, the article doesn't specify whether she was using Ongi or Jarawa. and even what word she used, but she did apparently overhear what she thought was an identifiable phrase in the Jarawa language, Nariyela Jabba Jabba, which, okay, now that I'm saying it out loud, it sort of sounds ridiculous, but it very well could be, since that's only a quote-unquote hunch. Another recent article in Nature, this time from 2024, adds that a piece of coral was thrown by one of the Sentinelese men when Pandit became separated from the group, who were apparently oblivious to what was going on. It also taught me that, contrary to my previous assumptions, official expeditions to North Sentinel Island are still being launched, though they seem to keep more of a distance now. They're run by a wing of local government meant to handle the welfare of the native Andamanese called the Andaman Adam Janjati Vikas Samiti, AAJVS, and they're only meant to ensure the social well-being of the Sentinelese people and to obtain headcounts of them. The Portman Expedition, 1880. There's one traumatic incident in particular that probably explains a lot of the Sentinelese' persistent resistance to the modern world. But it didn't happen in the 21st century or even the 20th century. It happened in January of 1880. And everything we know about it comes from the man who instigated it, a mysterious upper-class British colonial administrator named Maurice Vidal Portman, when the Andaman Islands were still ruled by the British. He played a big part in the island's story, visiting it off and on from 1880 to 1895, and crucially gave us some of our earliest and most detailed insights into the islanders' culture and their relationships with the other Andamanese. But that's near the bottom of the iceberg, so you'll have to wait for those juicy details. Portman was born in 1860 to an aristocratic family. His grandfather had even been a viscount, so he was sort of in the peerage, but for whatever reason he seems to have severed ties with his family and headed to the East Indies, where at only 19 years old he was made officer in charge of the Andamanese in 1879. He was extraordinarily curious about them and their lifestyle, though in a rather strange, condescending way typical of a Victorian. For example, he once said, "In many ways, they closely resemble the average lower-class English country schoolboy." I don't know if that's a compliment to the Andamanese or an insult to the English lower class, or both, but that's what he said. Portman was also oddly fond of taking photographs of them in different artificial and often poses, so I should mention here that there are allegations that he was a predator, but other sources claim that he was genuinely well loved amongst the Andamanese, to the envy of other contemporary anthropologists. But again, on the flip side, he also ran these things that were known as Andaman homes, which were essentially orphanages meant to inject British civilization into kidnapped Andamanese people, and he reportedly ran them efficiently and competently for longer than anyone else. By the time he retired in 1901, he'd written multiple books on the Andamanese, including a 2-volume book entitled The History of Our Relations with the Andamanese, which details his different forays onto North Sentinel, as well as a bunch of other stuff. But his first expedition there, undertaken only months after arriving in the Andamans, is the best known of them by far. I've heard it repeated again and again, but often with crucial details missing. And there's a reason why it's the best known of them. It was shockingly ruthless. But in order to give you the full picture, let me read what Portman himself wrote about it. I can't do the accent I just did because it would destroy my lungs. So enjoy this other horrible English accent. Early in January 1880, I paid a visit to the North Sentinel Island with Colonel Cattle. We saw tracks and villages, but none of the Aborigines. On the 26th of the same month, I went again to the island in the IGS Constance and stopped there for a fortnight. Captain Allen and Lieutenant Hooper of the Constance and Lieutenant H.H. Dobby of the European Detachment in Port Blair accompanied me in making a very thorough search throughout the interior of the island. The villages, weapons, and utensils of the North Sentinel people, I have since learnt, are exactly the same as those of the Ongis, and so far as I could tell, their customs seem to be the same. One day, while marching through the jungle, we came upon a camp of Jarawas, then an umbrella term the Sentinelese fit under, and captured a woman and 4 small children, unhurt. These were kept for a few days on board the Constance, and the woman and 1 child were then released with a quantity of presents. The Constance, a sailing schooner, went back to Port Moet for a day, during which time Lieutenant Hooper and I camped on a small islet off the northwestern end of the Sentinel. During the night, a bonfire, which we had lighted as a beacon for the Constance to steer by, attracted a very large number of sea snakes, Hydrophis species, which crept round us on the sand, and as their bite was certain death, effectually banished sleep. He had a little bit of a sense of humor. Anyways, a few days later, while crossing the island from the southeast to the western coast, Lieutenant Hooper and I met on a track in the middle of the forest an old man with his wife and child. Our party was spread out in crescent formation, and the Jawas came to the center where Lieutenant Hooper and I were. The old man had drawn his bow and was about to fire at Lieutenant Hooper's head when my convict orderly, a Pathan named Amir, who had been stationed at the right point of the crescent and had got behind the Jawas, jumped on his back and spoilt his aim. We caught the three unhurt and brought them on board. The next day we took the 6 Jarawa into Port Blair, where I kept them in my house for some days. They sickened rapidly, and the old man and his wife died, so the 4 children were sent back to their home with quantities of presents. Remarkably, and this seems to be left out of most other sources that quote Portman, he actually felt a little bit of self-awareness and recognized that the mission was an abject failure, though he does throw his fellow colonial Mr. Humphrey under the bus a bit. This expedition was not a success, for misled by Mr. Humphrey's statements regarding the numbers and ferocity of the Aborigines, they were met in a less conciliatory manner than was desirable, and we cannot be said to have done anything more than increase their general terror of and hostility to all comers. It would have been better to have left the islanders alone until the Ongis of the Little Andaman were tamed, and then to have approached them with the assistance of the latter. The facts which justify this view were not, however, known at the time. Later, after finding an Ongi interpreter named Tomiti, he wound up bringing him to North Sentinel in an attempt at communicating, which ultimately failed. In addition to this, Portman provides an almost unparalleled glimpse into the island's physical terrain, reporting that it's chiefly composed of coral and limestone. Large boulders of dead coral are to be found on the surface all over the island, the sharp edges of which make walking difficult and painful. But it's clear that he wasn't just making casual observations, and seems to have had some ulterior motives in mind. The soil is light and admirably suited for the growth of coconut palms, the surface drainage being excellent. The jungle is in many places open and park-like, and there are very beautiful groves of bulletwood trees. Magnificent specimens of the Bombas malabaricum are to be found, and interestingly, his account is the only one that stresses the Sentinelese' close relationship with the enormous trees they live around. The buttressed root of one was measured by Colonel Cattle and found to be 27 feet long and 15 feet high where it left the trunk. Aside from advertising North Sentinel as a potential coconut and hardwoods plantation, he then goes on to give a few really interesting remarks about what the Sentinelese themselves were like. The Aborigines are few in number and painfully timid. They resemble the Ongis, but of their language nothing is known. Their food, like that of the other Andamanese, consists of roots, fruit, fish, pig, and turtle, etc. And their methods of cooking and preparing their food resemble those of the Ongis, not those of the Aborigines of the Great Andaman. They dig small water holes in the dry weather and build lean-to huts, like those of the Jawas in the South Andaman, and of the Ongis, but do not make the large beehive-shaped huts seen as permanent villages in the Little Andaman among the Ongis. Sometimes they camp temporarily in the buttressed roots of trees. I have noticed exactly similar huts on the North Sentinel, the South Andaman, Rutland Island, the Senk Islands, and the South Brother Island. The North Sentinel Islanders smear themselves over with yellowish clay, as do the Jarawa tribes, but I have not seen them use red earth on their heads, possibly because this pigment is not found on their island. For reference, the Ongi put red earth on their closely shaved heads. This group of tribes do not wear the skulls of their deceased relatives, which is what the Great Andamanese do. But I have found, both on the North Sentinel and on the Little Andaman, the lower jawbones of men, ornamented with a fringe of twisted fiber, and evidently intended to be worn. In the former island, I also saw a skeleton of an old man, I think, placed in a large bucket in a sitting posture and hidden in the buttressed roots of a big tree. And, by the way, he likely stole the skeleton. In one place there, close to the village, was an immense heap of pig skulls, which delighted our Andamanese, as the tusks had not yet been taken from them, and my people spent an afternoon in collecting these. The great Andamanese he's referring to as our Andamanese used boar's tusks as spoke shaves to smoothen their bowstrings. The Ongi bow is rough and coarse, so I guess they and the Sentinelese don't apply boar tusks to them. This mention of a heap of boar's skulls is really interesting because TK Pandit recounts how he saw similar sights almost a century later in the 1970s. And that's all you're getting for today. Thank you so much for watching, especially after my 6-month-long hiatus. I know I haven't been around for a while. I have been working pretty much that entire time, but you know me, I go overboard with research, and I want to extend a special thanks to my patrons who've stuck with me through thick and thin. It's been a bit of a tough time. I mean, it started out as a great time. I went to Europe, and as you might have noticed, I re-uploaded the footage from that trip, or at least the amazing Dutch leg of it. 2 videos is better than 1, eh? And I hope I'll be able to get at least 1 more out by the end of the month, but we'll see. But anyways, as usual, let's go through the list of my most awesome supporters: Drew Singal, Bajan, Harrison Timperley, Doc Bossman, Kevin Ryan, Ayanami Amamami, Bomb Tombadil, Danny Banani, Little Bluebird 3843, James Kirk, Booga 420, Alyssa P, Mark Elliott Cullen, Jemek Wierzbicki, Jack Lester, Mithridates, Jake the Snake, Liv Buller, Inbred Cat, Have a Cigar, Alex Clark, Jess Sullivan, Akyune, Mark Krupnik, Miha Nidog, Michael, Daisies for Ghosts, Prince of Men, Julie Lau, Zafiro, Bean Burrito, and Albert VS. I just can't pronounce that beautifully Slavic name properly, so I'll just leave it. The Spoofer, Emily Cujo, Stevan, Gryphon Frost, Hippolyta, Magne de Broiker, Julia Erickson, JP Van Splendor, my man, the guy who I stayed with in Europe, Joseph Talley, Petra S, Generic Brand, Ryan Gregg, Glubberbob 200 and Glubberbob 20 trillion, Skiku, I think those two might be the same, but I'm not sure, Mason, Bread, Brandon Wood, Giovanna Lazzarini, Patrick Darius Gramodka, Artem, Chris J, Max X, Max S, The History Enjoyer, Daniel Battery Stapler, Machado de Assis, Menda Pruska, Alex Polisicchio, Lazy Ram, Weston Van Diver, Board Lord, It's Premium, Yogg, Jane Geeky, and Weston Van Diver. Welcome to my new patrons. Thank you so much. Your support is what makes the channel possible.